You're about to hear 5 true creepy stories from night divers. Story 1. The Light Below the Pier. Connor had been night diving for 9 years before this happened, mostly wreck and pier dives along a stretch of coastline he considered as familiar as his own house. Night diving was a fundamentally different discipline from diving during the day. The ocean, at night, wasn't simply darker. It was a different place, the visible world reduced to the small cone of your dive light, everything beyond that circle, simply gone, present only in sound and pressure, and the occasional brush of something passing close enough to feel but not see. Connor loved it precisely because of that reduction. He said it forced a kind of focus that daytime diving never demanded. He had a regular night dive he did roughly twice a month, a long municipal pier about 40 minutes from his house, pilings covered in growth that attracted a reliable population of nocturnal marine life. This happened on a warm night in July, a solo dive, always under the pier where the risk felt manageable and the depth never exceeded 25 feet. He entered the water a little after 10. The first 20 minutes were unremarkable. He worked his way along the piling slowly, cataloging the usual residents. A few sleeping parrotfish, a moray eel he recognized from previous visits. It was around the 30-minute mark that he noticed a light, not his own. A second light, small and distant, somewhere further out past the last row of pilings, in the direction of open water where there was, as far as he knew, absolutely nothing to dive on. No structure, no reef, nothing that would draw another diver out that far at night. He assumed, at first, reasonably enough, that it was simply another diver, someone he hadn't noticed enter the water, working a different section of the pier, or perhaps a nearby dive site he wasn't aware of. He continued his own dive, checking the light's position periodically. It stayed roughly the same distance away, neither approaching nor receding, hovering at the edge of what his own light could suggest, without fully revealing. After another 10 minutes, curiosity got the better of him. He altered his course slightly, moving toward the light to see who else was out there. The light matched his movement precisely, not toward him, not directly, which might have simply meant a curious diver drifting closer out of interest. But it shifted position in a way that kept the exact same rough distance between them at all times, as though whoever was holding it had adjusted their own path the very moment Connor adjusted his, a response too immediate and too consistent to be coincidence. He stopped moving to test this. The other light stopped moving too, or at least stopped changing position relative to him, hovering steadily in the black water beyond his own beam's reach. Connor felt the first genuine unease of the dive settle into his chest. He told himself it was simply another diver being cautious, staying at a respectful distance, nothing more sinister than ordinary courtesy. He decided, without much further deliberation, to end the dive early. He turned toward the pier and began making his way back to shore at a controlled but noticeably purposeful pace, checking behind him periodically, exactly as his years of training had taught him to do in any situation that felt even slightly wrong. The light followed, not directly behind him, off to one side, maintaining that same consistent distance, tracking his return path with a precision that felt, the longer it continued, less and less like coincidence. He surfaced near the shoreline at last, breathing hard, pulled his mask up onto his forehead, and turned to look back out at the dark water he'd just fled. The light was still visible from the surface, hovering roughly where it had been the entire time he swam back. A small, steady point of illumination in otherwise total darkness, far too distant from the pier to belong to any diver working that structure. He watched it for almost a full minute, treading water at the surface with his heart still hammering from the swim back, before it simply went out. Not moving away, not dimming gradually the way a light did when its battery finally failed, simply extinguished, all at once, as though someone had flipped a switch somewhere far beneath the surface. Connor got out of the water and sat on the beach for a long time afterward, still in his wetsuit, replaying the entire dive in his mind again and again, trying and failing to construct any rational explanation that accounted for everything he had personally observed that night. He mentioned the incident, cautiously, to the dive shop where he bought his gear, describing it as a strange encounter with what he assumed was another diver's unusually consistent tracking behavior. The owner of the shop, a woman who'd run dive operations along that stretch of coast for over 20 years, went quiet for a moment before asking him exactly where the light had been positioned relative to the pier. Connor described it as best he could, out past the last pilings, in the direction of open water with no structure to dive. She told him, carefully, that she'd heard something similar described before, more than once over the years, always from solo night divers at that specific pier, always describing a light in that same general direction, always positioned somewhere past the last row of pilings where there was, by any reasonable account, nothing at all to draw a diver's light out that far. One previous account, she said, had come from a diver who described something Connor hadn't mentioned at all. That diver claimed the light had, on that particular night, briefly flashed in a rapid, repeating pattern before going still again. 3 short flashes, a pause, 3 short flashes, again. The diver in question, an experienced sailor before he'd taken up diving, had recognized the pattern immediately. It was the International Distress Signal, SOS, blinked out in the darkness by something no one had ever been able to identify, reach, or explain. Connor asked her what she thought it was. She said she genuinely didn't know, and that in over 20 years running dive trips along that coast, she had made a personal rule never to dive that pier alone after dark, regardless of how familiar or safe the site otherwise felt. Connor asked why, if she didn't know what it was. She said that not knowing what it was struck her as exactly the reason to take the rule seriously. There was one more detail Connor almost didn't mention, something he only brought up after a long pause, as though deciding in the moment whether it was worth saying out loud. He had been wearing a small action camera mounted to his mask that night, standard practice for most of his dives, capturing continuous footage regardless of whether anything noteworthy happened. He reviewed that footage after speaking with the dive shop owner, expecting either nothing or, at best, a distant point of light matching what he remembered. The footage showed his own dive clearly, the pilings, the moray eel, his own light sweeping the familiar structure. It did not show the second light at all, not anywhere, not for a single frame, not once, across the entire recorded dive, including the several minutes he distinctly remembered watching it from the surface before it went out. He has watched that footage more times than he'd like to admit, frame by frame, slowing it down to a crawl in the exact direction he knew, with total certainty, he'd been looking that entire time. There is nothing there, only black water, exactly as it should have looked if nothing at all had ever been present. No light, no shape, no evidence whatsoever of the thing he had watched with his own eyes for nearly a full minute. He has not done a solo night dive at that pier since. He still dives it occasionally with a buddy, always staying well within sight of the pilings, and he told me he has never seen the light again. But he said he still checks, every single time, glancing out toward that same stretch of open water before he descends, just in case it's checking back. Story 2. The Wreck That Knew Her Name. This story comes from a woman named Josefina, a technical diver with extensive experience in deep wreck penetration, entering enclosed sections of sunken vessels and navigating corridors using guideline systems, a discipline that demanded absolute composure, since panic in a confined space could be fatal within minutes. She had logged over 400 wreck penetration dives across her career, including numerous night dives on wrecks she knew intimately. This happened on a wreck she had dived more than 30 times previously, a mid-sized cargo vessel resting upright in 90 feet of water, with an interior layout she considered as familiar as any building she'd ever worked in on land. She was diving with a partner that night, a fellow technical diver named Rourke. They entered the wreck through a familiar opening, laid their guideline according to standard protocol, and began working through a series of narrow corridors toward a cargo hold Josefina had explored numerous times before, always finding it unremarkable beyond the usual accumulation of marine growth and settled silt. About 15 minutes into the penetration, moving through a narrow corridor she could have navigated with her eyes closed. Josefina heard something through her regulator. Not through the water and the ambient sense divers grew accustomed to, the creaks and groans of a settling wreck, the distant hum of boat engines from the surface, a voice saying her name, clearly enough that she stopped moving immediately, one hand still on the guideline, and turned to check Rourke's position behind her, assuming he had somehow spoken to her despite the physical impossibility of clear speech through a regulator underwater. Rourke was several feet behind her, his own light steady, making no gesture or indication that he had said anything at all. She continued the dive after a brief pause, telling herself firmly that she had simply misheard some ordinary ambient sound, some trick of pressure and acoustics inside the confined metal corridor that her own mind, under stress, had processed and misinterpreted as her own name. 10 minutes later, deeper into the wreck now, approaching the cargo hold itself, she heard it again. Her name, clearer this time, closer somehow, despite her continued movement away from wherever the sound originated. She stopped again, checked Rourke, found him exactly where she expected, his attention focused on the guideline reel rather than on her. She signaled to him, using their established hand signals, asking if he had said anything. He signaled back, clearly confused by the question, indicating he had not. Josefina told me this was the exact point where genuine fear began to override her professional composure, a feeling she said she had rarely experienced across over 400 previous wreck dives, most of which had involved conditions considerably more objectively dangerous than this one: low visibility, entanglement risk, structural instability, none of which had ever once made her feel the way those two clear repetitions of her own name inside a sealed metal corridor had. She signaled to Rourke that she wanted to abort the penetration and exit the wreck. He agreed without hesitation, having noticed her hesitation even without understanding its cause. They began retracing the guideline back toward the entry point immediately, moving with the same controlled, disciplined efficiency their years of training demanded of them even now, under genuine stress, hands steady on the line despite everything. She heard her name a third time as they were nearly at the exit point, close enough now that she could see the ambient light from outside the wreck filtering through the opening ahead of them. This time, it was different. Not simply her name. Two words, spoken in that same impossible clarity, directly beside her ear, as though someone had positioned their mouth inches from her regulator. Almost there. She flinched hard enough that she nearly dropped her guideline reel, an involuntary reaction that took every ounce of her training to control before it compromised her exit. She told me those two words have stayed with her more than anything else from that dive, not because they were threatening on their own, but because of what they implied. Something had been tracking her progress back through the wreck closely enough to know, with precision, exactly how close to the exit she actually was. They exited the wreck without further incident and completed their required ascent according to standard decompression protocol, neither of them speaking a single word about what had actually happened until they were both safely back aboard the boat. Rourke, once they had surfaced and removed their regulators, asked her directly what had caused her to abort the dive. She told him about the voice, expecting some measure of skepticism given that he had heard nothing himself. Instead, he went quiet for a long moment before telling her that he had, in fact, heard something during the dive as well, something he had assumed was simply her voice attempting to communicate through her regulator despite the physical impossibility of that. He said what he'd heard was a name, not hers, his own. Josefina told me she has continued diving that wreck since, though never again as a night dive, and never again with a full penetration into that specific cargo hold. She said she has researched the wreck's history extensively, hoping to find some explanation, a recorded death, an incident during its sinking that might account for what they experienced. She found nothing conclusive, no documented fatalities associated with the vessel's original sinking, no obvious historical event that would explain a voice calling out names inside its corridors. She said she and Rourke have never fully discussed what happened beyond that initial conversation on the boat, an unspoken agreement between them to simply not examine it too closely. She said the thing she cannot fully explain, even now, years later, is not that the voice used their names. It's that it used the correct name for each of them, specifically, individually, as though it had known exactly who was listening at each precise moment it chose to speak. Story 3. What followed the line? This story is about a man named Desmond, a commercial diver performing underwater inspection work on offshore infrastructure, using surface-supplied air through an umbilical line rather than self-contained tanks. In constant communication with a surface tender monitoring his status throughout the dive, Desmond had worked commercial diving for 13 years, including numerous night dives on offshore platforms, where visibility rarely exceeded a few feet in the turbid coastal waters where he worked. This happened during a routine inspection of an offshore platform's support structure. He descended just after midnight, his tender that night a longtime colleague named Petrov. The water was unusually murky, visibility reduced to perhaps 2 feet, forcing Desmond to work almost entirely by feel, running his gloved hands along the platform's structural members. About 20 minutes in, Desmond felt something brush against his umbilical line, a deliberate tug, firm enough to register clearly but not forceful enough to alarm him immediately. He radioed Petrov to check whether the surface vessel had shifted position. Petrov confirmed the vessel was holding steady, no unusual movement. Desmond filed the tug away as a minor anomaly and continued. 10 minutes later, the tug happened again, stronger this time. He radioed Petrov again. Petrov reported everything normal on his end. Desmond told me this was when a cold unease began settling into his chest, the kind 13 years of diving had taught him not to dismiss. He continued working, more cautiously now, staying close to the structure as a point of reference in the near-total darkness. The third tug came without warning, hard enough this time that it pulled him several inches off the beam, an unmistakable, deliberate force that felt nothing like an accidental snag. He radioed Petrov immediately afterward, his voice carrying a genuine urgency that Petrov later described as unlike anything he'd ever heard from Desmond across their many years of working closely together. Petrov, now genuinely alarmed himself, confirmed again that nothing on the surface end could account for what Desmond was describing, and began preparations to bring him up immediately as a precaution. As Desmond began his own controlled ascent along the platform structure, moving hand over hand toward the surface, he felt the tug a fourth time, this one different from the others. Not a single sharp pull, but a sustained, steady tension, as though something below him had taken hold of the line and was actively, deliberately pulling against his ascent. Desmond told me this was the only moment in 13 years of commercial diving, across countless dives in far more objectively hazardous conditions, that he genuinely believed, with total clarity, that he might not make it back to the surface that night. He communicated this to Petrov as calmly as he could manage under the circumstances, his voice tight but controlled as he described the sustained resistance on the line, and Petrov, without hesitation, began working the surface winch to assist his ascent, adding steady mechanical force to counteract whatever was pulling against him from somewhere in the darkness below. The resistance held for what Desmond estimated to be almost 30 seconds, an eternity under those specific circumstances, before it released all at once, the line going suddenly slack in a way that nearly caused him to shoot upward faster than was safe for his depth. Petrov, working the winch from the surface, told Desmond afterward that he had felt something through the mechanism itself in those final seconds before the release, a sensation he struggled to fully describe even to a fellow diver who trusted him completely. He said it hadn't felt like resistance from tangled structure or current. It had felt, in his own words, like something on the other end had simply let go on purpose. Deliberately, the way you'd release your grip on something once you'd decided you were finished with it. He completed his full ascent and required decompression stops according to protocol, visibly shaken but physically unharmed, and was finally pulled aboard the support vessel by Petrov and the rest of the anxious surface crew who had been monitoring the entire ordeal. The umbilical line itself was inspected thoroughly once Desmond was safely aboard. No damage, no snags, no entanglement, Nothing that would explain the sustained tension Desmond had experienced and Petrov had felt through the winch resistance during the final assisted ascent. Desmond requested, and was granted, reassignment away from night dives on that specific platform going forward. He told me he has since spoken with several other commercial divers who have worked that same platform over the years, cautiously raising the subject without fully explaining his own experience at first. Two of them, independently, described similar incidents. Unexplained tension on their umbilical lines during night dives at that location, always occurring roughly 20 to 30 minutes into the dive, always escalating across the duration of the work before eventually releasing. Neither of them had ever reported it officially, both citing the same concern that had initially kept Desmond quiet about his own experience. Nobody believed a commercial diver who claimed something in the water was pulling on his line with deliberate intention. One of those two divers, a woman with nearly 20 years in commercial work, offered Desmond a detail he found more unsettling than anything he had experienced himself. She told him that during her own incident, in the final moments before the tension released, she had felt something touch her leg directly, through her suit, a distinct pressure against her calf that lasted only an instant before vanishing along with the tension on her own line. She said it hadn't felt like an accidental brush against structure. It had felt, in her words, like something checking to see if she was still there, confirming, before it let go, exactly what it had been holding on to. Desmond said he no longer works that platform under any circumstances, day or night. He said he has never found an explanation and has stopped actively looking for one. He said some structures, in his considerable professional experience, simply don't want people working on them after dark, and he has learned, the hard way, to respect that boundary without needing to fully understand it. Story 4. The Buddy Who Wasn't There. This story comes from a woman named Adeline, an experienced recreational night diver who had been diving socially with the local dive club for close to 8 years before this happened. Night diving with the club followed a strict buddy system. Divers required to maintain constant visual contact with their partner throughout the dive, checking in periodically with hand signals. This happened during a club night dive on a popular local reef, a site Adeline had dived dozens of times previously. She was paired that evening with a diver named Franklin, someone she had dived with several times before and trusted implicitly, a calm, methodical diver whose movements she knew well. They entered the water together, descended together, and began working along the reef, staying within a few feet of each other, checking in periodically, exactly as trained. About 25 minutes into the dive, Adeline turned to check Franklin's position, a routine check she performed every few minutes without conscious thought at this point in her diving career. Franklin was there, exactly where she expected him, his light steady, his posture relaxed and familiar. She continued the dive. 5 minutes later, she checked again. Franklin was still there, but something about him felt subtly different, though she couldn't immediately identify what. She attributed the feeling to nothing more than the general disorientation that sometimes crept in during longer night dives, and continued working the reef. At the 35-minute mark, she surfaced briefly to check her computer and adjust her buoyancy. A routine pause that took perhaps 30 seconds before she descended again to rejoin Franklin at their working depth. When she reached him again, he seemed, for just a moment, to hesitate before continuing the dive. A small pause in his movement that struck her as slightly unfamiliar, though she attributed it to nothing more than a momentary equipment adjustment. They continued the dive for another 15 minutes after that, working steadily and methodically along the reef structure until Adeline's air supply finally reached the point where standard protocol required her to signal for their ascent back to the surface. She signaled to Franklin, who acknowledged, and they began their controlled ascent together, completing a standard safety stop before surfacing. It was only once they were both on the surface, masks removed, treading water while waiting for the boat to make its way over to collect them, that Adeline realized, with a jolt that momentarily stole her breath, that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The diver beside her, close enough to touch, was not Franklin. It was a stranger, someone she had never seen before, staring back at her with an expression of equal confusion and alarm. Both of them, it emerged rapidly in the frantic, confused conversation that followed on the surface, had believed with total confidence that they were diving with their original assigned buddy for the entire second half of the dive, never once suspecting otherwise despite the close physical proximity involved. The stranger, a visiting diver named Castellano, who was diving with a different club that same evening, described exactly the same experience from his side. He had descended with his own buddy, a woman named Reyes, and had, at some point he couldn't precisely identify, found himself diving beside someone he now realized was not her at all. When the boat crews from both separate dive groups eventually converged on the water to sort out the mounting confusion between them, a deeply unsettling, almost impossible picture slowly began to emerge. Franklin and Reyes, the two original buddies, had also somehow ended up together during the same dive, each initially believing the other to be their own assigned partner, only realizing the mix-up once they too had surfaced. 4 divers, 2 buddy pairs, somehow, impossibly, swapped partners mid-dive on a completely routine, well-visited reef that none of them had ever considered remotely dangerous, with none of the 4 able to identify the exact moment the switch had actually occurred. All 4 divers involved were genuinely experienced, no novices among them. All 4 had performed the standard buddy checks throughout their respective dives, checking in periodically exactly as their training demanded, never once consciously noticing they were swimming directly beside the wrong person entirely. Adeline told me the explanations offered afterward: mistaken identity and low visibility, similar equipment configurations between the pairs, simply didn't hold up against the length of time involved. Over 20 minutes of continuous proximity with someone none of them had consciously recognized as unfamiliar. There was one detail, though, that none of the 4 divers mentioned to the boat crews that evening, something Adeline only told me after a long pause in our conversation. When she and Castellano compared their dive computers afterward, out of simple curiosity about the timing of the swap, they discovered something neither could explain. Both computers showed a brief gap in logged depth data, not a malfunction, a clean, precise gap lasting exactly 41 seconds, occurring at almost the identical moment on both devices. 41 seconds during which, according to the data, neither diver's computer had recorded any depth reading at all, as though, for those 41 seconds, neither of them had technically been anywhere. Adeline had the manufacturer review the raw data from both devices. They called back 2 days later, confirming the gap wasn't a malfunction. Both computers had been functioning perfectly throughout the entire dive. There was simply no depth signal recorded for those 41 seconds. No explanation given. She said what unsettled her most, turning it over many times since, was that brief hesitation she'd noticed in Franklin's movement right after her surface pause. A small pause that, she now believed, might have marked the exact moment the switch actually happened, though she still cannot explain how, or by what mechanism, 2 separate buddy pairs could have exchanged partners underwater without any of the 4 divers noticing at the time. She still dives with that same club. She still trusts the buddy system in principle, but she checks her partner's face now, deliberately, every single time she surfaces from even the briefest pause during a night dive. Not just the light, not just the silhouette, the face, every time. Story 5. The Cave That Counted Wrong. This is the last story, and the man who shared it with me asked that I not identify the specific cave system involved, a request I have honored throughout this account. His name is Bertrand, a highly experienced cave diver, a discipline that involves navigating fully enclosed underwater passages with no direct access to the surface, entirely dependent on guideline systems to find the way back out. He had been cave diving for over 15 years and had, by the time this happened, logged hundreds of dives in cave systems around the world. This happened during an expedition with 3 other experienced divers, 4 divers in total, exploring a system they had partially mapped across previous visits. Cave diving protocol required constant awareness of team position, each diver periodically confirming the team remained together, a discipline made considerably more critical by the complete absence of any surface access in an emergency. The team entered the cave system just after nightfall, 4 divers, laying guideline deeper into an unexplored section. About 40 minutes in, deep enough that direct ascent was no longer possible, Bertrand performed a routine team count. 4 divers, correct. They continued the dive for another 20 minutes after that first count, moving carefully into a newly discovered chamber that showed genuinely promising formations, exactly the kind of find worth documenting extensively for future expeditions into the system. At the next routine count, conducted as the team paused to photograph a particular formation, Bertrand counted 5. He counted again immediately, assuming an error in his initial count, given the low visibility and confined space of the chamber. 5 divers. He signaled urgently to the rest of his team, indicating that the count was wrong and that every diver needed to stop immediately. The other 3 divers performed their own count. Each of them counted 5 as well. Bertrand told me the specific quality of fear he experienced in that particular moment was unlike anything else in 15 years of cave diving, a discipline he had always approached with the calm, professional understanding that death was a real and present possibility, one he had made peace with long ago, but had never, until that exact moment, felt so viscerally, immediately present in the confined space, pressing in around him on all sides. The team began identifying each diver individually and methodically, checking equipment configurations and specific tank markings against their known team roster from memory, a careful process made considerably more difficult by the chamber's limited visibility and the 4 experienced divers' own rapidly rising anxiety. They were able to positively identify 3 of their own team members through equipment markings each of them recognized. Bertrand himself made the 4th confirmed identification, checking his own gear configuration against what he expected to find. That left 1 diver in the chamber, whose equipment none of them recognized, whose configuration matched none of their team's standardized gear. Present among them despite the complete physical impossibility of anyone joining a fully submerged cave team 40 minutes deep into an enclosed system with no external access point. The unidentified diver made no aggressive movement, no gesture toward any of them. It simply remained present in the chamber, its own light steady, seemingly as unbothered by the situation as the 4 confirmed team members were terrified by it. Bertrand told me the detail that has stayed with him longest, the one he has the hardest time explaining to anyone who wasn't there, was the light itself. Every diver's light had a distinct quality, a particular color temperature and beam pattern determined by the specific model and bulb configuration each of them used. Bertrand knew his team's lights the way you knew the voices of people you worked closely with. The 5th light matched none of their 4 lights exactly, but it also, somehow, matched all of them at once. He said it seemed to shift, subtly, the longer he looked at it, taking on a quality closer to whichever of their own lights happened to be pointed nearest to it at any given moment, as though it wasn't its own light at all, as though it was simply reflecting theirs back at them, borrowed rather than produced, worn the way a mask was worn. Bertrand signaled his team to begin an immediate, controlled return to the entry point, abandoning the exploration and prioritizing exit above all other considerations. The team began moving back along their guideline in the order they had established for exactly this kind of emergency, Bertrand taking point, the other 3 following in sequence. He performed another count once they began moving. 4. The 5th diver was gone, as inexplicably absent as it had been inexplicably present, with no visible exit route it could have taken in the intervening seconds beyond the same guideline the team itself was using. The team completed their exit and surfaced without any further incident, the entire remaining dive conducted in a state of tightly controlled, disciplined fear that Bertrand later described as the single most difficult act of professional composure he had ever been required to maintain in his entire career. Once safely back on the surface, The four of them compared their individual accounts extensively for over an hour, each one independently confirming the exact same sequence of events, the same count discrepancy, the same brief but undeniable presence of a fifth diver none of them could identify, explain, or account for. Bertrand has continued cave diving since that expedition, though he told me he has never once returned to that specific system, and has permanently adjusted his own personal protocols to include even more frequent team counts than standard practice technically requires, a habit the rest of his regular team has adopted without question once he explained why. He said he has spoken, quite cautiously, with a small, carefully chosen number of other extremely experienced cave divers over the years since, always raising the subject slowly and indirectly at first, gauging their reaction closely before deciding whether to share his own full account with them. Two of those experienced divers, independently and in entirely different cave systems on opposite sides of the world, described experiences that shared the exact same core, unmistakable detail. An inexplicable extra diver appearing suddenly during a night dive deep in a fully enclosed system, present only briefly before vanishing completely the moment the team began its exit. Neither of those two divers had ever previously spoken about their own experience publicly, for exactly the same, careful, self-protective reasons that had kept Bertrand himself quiet about his own encounter for so long afterward. Nobody wanted to be the cave diver who claimed the count had somehow, impossibly, come out wrong. One of those two divers offered Bertrand a detail that has stayed with him, more than anything, from his own experience. In her case, the extra diver mirrored her team's exact movements as they exited, close enough that she felt the displaced water from its fins against her legs. Then it fell into position directly behind the last diver in their exit line, taking up the rear, as though it understood and was actively participating in their own safety protocol. It vanished only once they reached open water. Bertrand told me he still doesn't have an explanation and has stopped searching for one with any real conviction. What he has instead, he said, is a single, absolute rule he has never once broken since that night, regardless of how experienced his team or how thoroughly mapped the system. Count twice, every single time. And if the number ever comes out wrong a second time, in exactly the same way it did that night, leave immediately. Don't wait to understand why. Subscribe for more late-night stories, a new one every week. 5 stories, 5 encounters in dark water that left something behind. Connor still checks the open water before he descends. Josefina still wonders how it knew both their names. Desmond still won't work that platform, day or night. Autoline still checks the face, every time, and Bertrand still counts twice. If you ever dive at night and something feels like it's keeping pace with you, trust that feeling completely. Some things in the dark already know exactly who you are. Good night.